Hi, I'm Dick DeAngelis, producer of the Fairfield History Series, and in our first film, Life Before Fairfield, we had the opportunity to interview Cynthia Peterson. She's with the Office of the State Archaeologist and is an expert in the Ioway people and some of the research she did in Iowaville, just outside of Jefferson County, near the Des Moines River, is some of the most fascinating research done in the state, I believe. So you're going to get a chance to hear all about that research, what she did, what they found out about the Ioway people who lived right here in Jefferson County. Here's Cynthia Peterson.
My name is Cynthia Peterson, and I was a professional archaeologist here at the University of Iowa for 22 or 23 years, and now I work at the Army Corps of Engineers. One of the first things I heard about Iowaville was just that there's a spectacular artifact collection from the site, that lots of folks go out there to collect things for their own personal pleasure. A couple years before we did an excavation at Iowaville, another archaeologist and myself went out and just walked across the site. It was recently plowed. You could see the ground very clearly. And we knew thousands and thousands of artifacts had been found there. I was hopeful that we would find a large number of materials, but we found absolutely nothing over the whole site. So later, when we wanted to come back to test if there was anything left at the site, I wasn't very hopeful that we were going to find really much of anything. We received a REAP grant, which uses lottery money to help fund the excavation. So when we first got out at the site, the first thing we had to do was work with the National Park Service to use what's called a Magnetometer Survey. We didn't have a lot of money to do a ton of digging, so we were using the magnetometer to help pinpoint the spots where we should dig. So the first couple of weeks we were there, we were just walking back and forth over the site using volunteers and the professionals from the Park Service to try to pinpoint where we should dig. Before we even applied for the grant, we contacted the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska and the Iowa tribe of Oklahoma to see if they had an interest in participating. And the Iowa tribe of Kansas and Nebraska decided they would like to have a tribal elder on the site with us every day, supervising and just making sure everything was being done to their satisfaction, and someone who could report back to the tribe what was going on. And so his name is Pat Murphy, and he was out every day helping dig, helping screen, and then talking to all the different volunteers. He was a great resource that anyone who came out to volunteer or folks would just hear about it, word of mouth, and just stop by and see what was going on for an hour or a few minutes. And he would interact with them and talk to them about the history of the tribe and this particular site. Every evening, Steve DeVore, who is the National Park Service person running the magnetometry, he would download all the computer data, and then he would show it to me on his laptop the next day. And pretty quickly, after only a day or two, we realized there were lots of, you call them anomalies, that is, magnetic readings that aren't normal, which means it's an area that's been disturbed, hopefully during the time period when the Ioway were there. So probably by the second or third day, we knew there might be something still there below that plowed field. Even though we couldn't see it, just looked like any old farm field in Iowa. That was the first inkling. Again, there's not a lot of money, so you want to target what you're doing to where you're going to get the biggest bang for your buck. And so we were targeting different kinds of anomalies on that map to see what they might represent. So a really dark, intense anomaly, we might put a hole there. Or an area where it looks like they're in a circle, we might put a hole there. And so we only dug 8 holes about 3 foot by 3 foot. Each hole we put in, we got a little bit different answer. For example, we got that ditch and embankment enclosure, which was new information. Nobody knew the Ioway did that at their villages during that time period. At another spot, it seems like the other circle, the smaller circle, it looks like it's enclosed by large, large logs, ranging in size from this big around to the biggest one we saw was this big around. So that was also new information. At another spot, we found a huge bell-shaped pit. And that means the top of the pit is narrow and then it flares out like a bell. And that was full of mostly garbage, just household garbage. In one corner of the bell, someone had stored things like gun barrels and mussel shells and silver jewelry. Presumably they were going to come back for it. In another hole, we got what's probably a house, the basin of a house. And I think the remaining holes mostly had smaller sized pits, all filled with debris. And by debris, I mean anything left over from daily life of the Ioways from 1765 until the 1820s. Oftentimes when you think of a Native American site, you'll think of this sort of globular, mud-looking pottery in Iowa, and we didn't get hardly any pieces of this Ioway-made pottery, and we also didn't get very much of the pottery they would have been purchasing from traders, and that's because they're mostly using copper buckets. And if you've seen any of the collections from Iowaville, that's something that the collectors have, lots of little tiny, tiny pieces of these copper or brass buckets. So the Ioway would trade furs and deer skins to traders who'd come through, British and French, and we think maybe some early Spanish traders might have been at the area. And in exchange, they would get things like cloth, which we don't find any archaeological traces of cloth. But we do find beads, so you get beads, and then guns. Guns is the other really big thing, and those kettles that I talked about, brass and copper kettles. Now for guns, we don't find a whole gun, but we do find entire barrels and triggers, the side plates. Something that's really neat about Iowaville is during that time period, there were these decorative side plates on the guns, and they're snakes, they're serpents. And so we find these little sinuous pieces of brass that would go on the side, and dozens of those have been found. The level of pipe making that was going on at the site during that time. Even today, pipes made from pipestone or catlinite are very special to a lot of Ioway folks. And what we found is that that was a tradition that was very actively going on at Iowaville. Folks were still bringing in the pipestone from southwestern Minnesota and manufacturing their own pipes here because I didn't let the volunteers throw a single rock away in the field. We brought every tiny little rock back. So we have lots of these tiny little pieces of pipestone that are just the residue or the garbage from making pipes. The one thing that I hear now when I give talks about Iowaville is everyone asks the question, so I heard there was a big massacre of Indians there at the site. Can you tell me about that? That's the question I always get. There's a story about how the Sac, or the Sauk, with Black Hawk, Chief Black Hawk, came to Iowaville, snuck up on folks there, and killed a very large number of Ioway. And this story is not just a local history story, but it was picked up by these county history books. And so you find it in almost any county history book in Iowa, the reproduction of the story of the slaying of Ioway. The story apparently originated from a man named James Jordan, who was a very early trader in what later became Davis County, right next to Iowaville. I think he probably came there about 1828. So he wasn't there when the Ioway lived at Iowaville. But he told a story about this massacre, and it's since then become fact. However, there's no archaeological evidence that such a massacre took place. There's no real concentration of human remains. There's some incidental reports that human remains were found, but we never found any human remains. As far as I am aware, there are not Ioway or Sac or Meskwaki, that is Fox, stories about this massacre. So it doesn't seem to have any basis in reality, or at least we have no evidence that it happened other than the word of James Jordan. although Iowaville is about a mile from Jefferson County, the earliest surveyors who came to survey the section lines before land got sold to the settlers, they sometimes mapped in trails. Some of the trails lead from Iowaville up to the area that is now Fairfield, and some of the trails lead from about the Fairfield area over to this Sack and Fox farm, which is just over the Jefferson County line. So these trails oftentimes developed into the major highways in Iowa. And so even though Iowaville, again, isn't quite in Jefferson County, there's a trail showing that folks from Iowaville were certainly cutting up through Jefferson County, probably to go hunting all the time and exploit the natural resources there.